In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the layout of the island. The plan for this video is to take a break from Google Maps. I'm not going to show a ton of pictures this early on because most of the pictures will relate to other videos, but I have a couple of models or photographs of models in an old drawing that's a little more current. Um, just to kind of talk about the layout, this is not exactly what the island would look like today. This photo is taken at the ferry landing for the boat or ferry to Alcatraz Island. I thought it was really cool. There's a smaller model that's located on the island in the administrative wing, and then in this building over here, which is the called the New Industries building, on the wall there is a this drawing or diagram of the island. So all I'm going to do for this video is talk about what these buildings are. I thought this first model showed a really clear picture of the slope, the natural terrain of the island. Obviously, you can see where it had been altered by the U.S. military. This flat area is called the parade grounds. These houses all along the parade grounds are all family housing. So during the penitentiary years, a lot of a lot of officers, employee families would have lived on the island. It's not very clear whether it would have been a requirement, but it would have been, at least very early on, a strong suggestion that officers live on the island. Um, there's an added perk here that the rent on the island was extremely cheap compared to nearby San Francisco. A lot of the officers who wouldn't have made a lot of money wouldn't have been able to afford the rent in San Francisco, so this was a really a positive thing for them. Obviously, that's something that attaches for the general public, this idea that the officer's family and there would have been little kids running around. That's a really fascinating concept. There's been tons of interviews with the kids that grew up on the island, and they all kind of pretty much say the same thing. They never really thought about it. Occasionally, they saw uh, maybe a convict or an inmate. They weren't allowed in the cell house or anything like that. They didn't lock their doors. They were safe. They would say or quip, all the bad guys on Alcatraz were locked up, so you didn't have to worry about locking your door. This is what we now refer to as 64 building. During the penitentiary years, this would have been home to mostly new officers and their families. It is also the old barracks when it was occupied by the military. Here is the original, or it's not the original dock. The original dock was built in 1854. It's been modified or enlarged since that time period, but there is only the one dock on the island. The cell block, as I point out, I'm going to come to this other photo shows better. Here's the cell block. So when we talk about housing on the for inmates, everybody is housed in this one large building. So again, here's the dock, the 64 building, family housing. Here is a little fog signal building. San Francisco Bay, if you've never visited, is often covered in layers of fog, so it would have been really common for a lot of the island to be semi-visible or invisible to ships coming in. Also, I haven't really mentioned too much of the lighthouse. The lighthouse was eventually rebuilt, but the first lighthouse, not depicted here, was the very first lighthouse on the Pacific coast. It became necessary, and again, part of the fog is going to make it hard for ships to safely navigate. So that these ideas, recreation yard, you'll notice a little door in the wall there. Inmates working in the Industries building would be traversing a very steep set of stairs. They would come into the cell house through this back door down here, and I'll show pictures of that in later videos. The water tower, it's actually kind of interesting as you look at the island. Doesn't really show too much here. You can see the lighthouse here and the water tower here. Looks like the lighthouse is a lot taller, simply because it's at a higher elevation. The water tower is actually taller than the lighthouse. So move down to other buildings. As I mentioned in the Fort Alcatraz video, the original guardhouse and Sallyport, this would have been this building here. See if I can come back to this Sallyport and guardhouse. Here would have been this little side building, an electric repair shop. Here, and on this map it shows it a little easier to say. And you'll note on this is a more updated version. These models are kind of historic, what it would have been like in its operating days. And this is more of a, this is what it looks like now view. You can see under several of these buildings ruins. This is the Wardens House. As we come back here, this large, it's a 15-room mansion. The Lightkeeper's quarters, that officers club or post exchange building is labeled in ruins. You'll notice on the parade grounds all these buildings. As we come to this new diagram, it'll just say ruins, rubble, things like that. So those are no longer standing in on Alcatraz Island. But the officers club or the post exchange would have been a place for officers to entertain themselves. They would have had a very small grocery store. There would have been a little club, a dance hall, a gymnasium. There was a small bowling alley, a soda fountain for kind of rest and relaxation. There would have been probably 20 or so trips from the island to the mainland, San Francisco. So this really small grocery store wouldn't have been the only place where you needed or you had to get stuff. You could have made trips to the island. Again, probably a 20-minute ride, not super far, but for little odds and ends, you could have shopped at the Officers Club. There's a little warehouse, the power plant. This is the Model Industries building. So I don't think there's a good view here. This way back in this building. The new Industries building will house the laundry room or the laundry services. There will be in the cell block in the basement. There will be a clothing room. We'll talk more about those things later on down the road. As we look at these, I do want you to keep in mind the steep terrain, that none of these show the distance from San Francisco. Again, a 20-minute boat ride. As you stand in these spots, if you came out the administrative building, let's see if there's, right here is the main entrance into the cell block. If you would have come out here onto this little terrace or plaza, it would have had a pretty good view of the island. Or excuse me, you would have had a pretty good view of San Francisco from the island. Inmates that were brought in from the dock would have come up the road here. They would have entered the cell block from the backside. They wouldn't have seen that view immediately. Eventually, there's going to be inmates working in these areas from time to time. Inmates were known to help move furniture, paint apartments for people moving in, loading and unloading from the dock. And again, they would have daily traversed this staircase in the back up from the new Industries building across the rec yard back into the cell house. So they would have had plenty of opportunity to view across the bay to potential freedom. In the next video, what we're going to do is I'm going to come into just the cell block and show its layout and design, talk a little bit about it before we move on to a few more interesting things about the island.